All right, hello everybody. We are back. I am Davood Gozli. I'm here with John David and Daniel Garner, also known as OG Rose. You know, OG Rose team.
Wife and Dan, Opperman
Right.
Garner, yeah, Rose. So thank you, Davood.
Sure. It's great to be with you to discuss chapter 4 of. Am I right? Fourth
Five.
chapter or fifth? Chapter 5 of. Oh, I read the wrong chapter. No, I'm kidding.
Oh. Wouldn't that be something?
Don't worry,
Yeah.
I've done that before. I have definitely done that.
The fifth chapter in this book, it was titled "The Fictions of Factual Representation," and I finally have my physical copy. I don't have to rely on a pirated e-copy of the book. So as we were talking about before I hit record, there are some repetitions in this chapter. He brings back some of the themes related to style, tropes, the rhetorical devices in presentation of historical facts. And we have some examples. We have some new examples. We have the example of Darwin, which is interesting. We'll get to that maybe later on. And he also presents the progression of historiography from the 18th century prior to the French Revolution, and then after the French Revolution in 19th century and to the present day. And he talks about the empiricist prejudice that wants to present history and historiography as exclusively about facts, and there's no fiction in facts. And Hayden White wants to continue to get over that prejudice, to reveal to us the linguistic devices, the poetic devices that are shared in common, both in the presentation of historical facts and in the presentation of fictional narratives. I think I'll stop here. Maybe I'll pass it to the next person.
So Davood talked about the Hayden White sort of historicizing this problem of, I guess, the internal politics of what goes on in historiography. And he talks, White talks about how much before about maybe 200 years ago, you had a consensus position all over the board that you had fictive elements in historiography. And what he keeps using is the position of the historiographer versus the novelist, and that both modes of representation, both people are trying to ultimately do the same thing. The novelist is ultimately pointing towards something that only happened maybe in their own head. The historiographer ultimately pointing towards, with their words, towards something that actually happened. But they are both using the tools of language and the tropes of language to do so. So on a very superficial level, and it turns out on more than just a superficial level, they're kind of doing the same thing, even though if what they're pointing to is actually located in different spaces of truth. Mm-hmm. One is actually the real world and time in which we walk around in, and the other one is the world of the novel. But sometime during the 19th century, you get this sort of hyper-empiricism, this positivism that sneaks into historiography, which tries to redefine truth as being completely non-fictive in every single way. So what it tries to do is hide everything about it that is self-consciously linguistic. Whereas before, you would have had writers like, and he lists them off, he lists Burckhardt, he lists Edward Gibbon, as people who are very familiar with how language and causal chains and implicature in affect and shape their writing. And then you sort of reach this point where he mentions this quote about Hegel, not Hegel, Nietzsche, talking about how a discipline is defined by how what the gatekeepers do and what you don't do. And there comes a point to where there's just the gatekeepers in historiography don't want you to talk about language. They want you to assume that it's clear and transparent and to sweep everything else under the rug, or to sweep that under the rug and to only talk about the facts. Mm-hmm. But the whole point he's making, including we'll talk about later with his Darwin example, is that facts never speak for themselves. Facts need a language. Facts need a historian to speak for them. And that speaking is all about the fictive element that he's talking about in the essay.
No, that's wonderful, John, and thank you, Davood. Yeah, he had that part. I felt like in this section of the book, he did a very good job of very succinctly and well saying some of the ideas he had been building up to. It's almost like when you keep building and you go, that's a way to say it. Where he has that part, to your point, John, he says historians are concerned with events which can be assigned to specific time, space, locations, events which are or were in principle observable or perceivable, whereas imaginative writers are concerned with both these kinds of events and imagined, hypothetic, or invented ones. I thought that was really good. And then he made that great line too, where he said something like, readers of histories and novels can hardly fail to be struck by the similarities. I think that very succinctly kind of captured. And I had this idea of an alien coming down, and they were reading, maybe Larson's on the Lusitania, or maybe Shelby Foote or something like that. And then you gave him Virginia Woolf, and you didn't tell him which was fiction and which was history. The alien actually may struggle to be able to tell like which one is fiction and which is which not. It just kind of really kind of hit me quite well. I also really like that part, and it reminded me of what we were saying about the chronicle and how a chronicle would be a list of facts. And he says something on 122, a mere list of confirmable singular existential statements does not add up to an account of reality if there is not some coherent logical or aesthetic connecting them to one another. That was really lovely, because it also made me kind of think about the fact that like reality actually isn't a collection of facts. It's kind of weird. Like the event by which I'm sitting here talking with you guys and stuff is moving and the facts are changing. Like there's the fact I'm saying this and now the fact I'm saying that, and that you're saying, like, it's like moving, right? And actually the event, I guess I almost want to call it in a kind of Bourdieu, the event is almost more fundamental than just the facts. Like if afterwards we then listed everything out in facts, we go, oh, that was like the fundamental reality. And yet in a very funny way, the event is more fundamental than the facts. But then after the event, we create a list of facts and say that that was the fundamental reality, when in fact we never ever exist in a reality that is just a chronicle of facts. So there's this kind of funny move that happens there. And since I've been talking so much with Cato Last recently on Hegel and his absolute knowing, so you have the idea of the truth, which is Wittgenstein, everything that is the case, everything that is the case, collection of facts, where in Hegel, the absolute is everything that is the case, plus you, plus the subject. And the funny thing about that is if you're involved, then you interact with the facts, which changes you, which then changes how you interact with the facts. And there's this circular motion that you always have to take account of. So in Hegel, like if you're only talking about everything that is the case, the truth, you're actually not even talking about reality, like, because you have to include the subject and the people that are interacting with those facts and how they make those facts come into existence. It's almost like if you talk about a chronicle, I guess my Grace turns 4 tomorrow. I don't know where the years go by. And I was as I was playing with her, I had this idea, like, it's almost like in order for a chronicle to be realistic, it's like this room right now that has the collection of the cup and the computer. It's almost like there'd have to be a big bang, like boom, the start of the universe. And here's the room. Just a collection of facts, and here it is. And like, if that's how it worked, and I just gave you a chronicle of facts, if this room just came into existence, then that would be accurate. But that, of course, is not how it goes. And so it was funny because I was just reading this section, and it really did kind of strike me how how it really is not the case at all that life is like a chronicle of facts. And yet, for some reason, like you were mentioning, John, there was this movement where he said everyone blamed mythic thinking for the excesses and failures of the revolution. I think he's talking about the French Revolution. And so there's this idea that, if we can demystify, which then turns into defictionalize, we'll actually get more to the truth. We won't make those same mistakes, when actually that makes things more abstract and less livable and less real. Like you're getting the truth, but not the absolute. You're getting a chronicle, but you're not getting the world. So it's kind of funny how that occurred. And then to close, before I pass it back to Davood, I almost had this image too. You know how you have those paintings that are the pointillism, where you have a point and you like make it because you just do like points? It's almost like the historians got together and said, dude, this is how we're going to do history. We'll just make little points and then they'll add up into an image. And that's how you get fact. You keep doing all the little points. And so at the end, there's this image and someone comes along and say, look, guys, this is the history. And you kind of look at it and you're like, how did you get an image of a swan? I don't know. I just did I just did dots. The swan came out of the dots. Everyone would look at them and go, no, that's not how that works. If those dots added up into a swan, there must have been a pre-existing structure. You must have had an idea of making a swan. So it's almost like what's happened is historians think that they can do a pointillism picture. And if it's coherent, like if it was just random, like if it was like you'd be like, I can't read this. And if you can read it, then people like, you do know you must have had the idea of a swan when you were making that painting, right? And they're like, no, I just listed dots of facts and it came together. But obviously anyone would look at that and say, no, there must have been a structure you had in mind when you were doing that pointillism painting. So that was kind of the thing I had, the kind of image I had in mind as I was reading this.
And it's an interesting comparison, because if you know how the eye works, and you know the tricks that the eye can play on you, and that the assumptions an eye makes when it's actually sending messages, well, it's actually not your eye, it's your brain, right? the assumptions that your brain makes, that's how pointillism works in the first place. Yeah. So if you know how language works in the same sense, you can sort of, it's a very, very rough analogy.
Oh, sure.
That was a great image, and it ties in well with the part that John mentioned, the part about the disciplinary prohibitions, like the discipline of history prohibits mention of anything other than facts, and by prohibiting that prohibition, what it does is it doesn't remove acts of interpretation, bringing coherence and conceptual organization, but instead a self-conscious use of those things. Now, the historian has to draw those dots on the piece of paper, and they end up creating an image. But what they cannot do is that they cannot self-consciously admit, they cannot admit to that higher level creativity that they are doing. There was a passage here on page 123 where White is describing the beliefs, the state of affairs prior to the French Revolution, and how truth was viewed back then. It's in the middle of the page where he says, truth, according to them, was not equated with fact, but within a combination of facts. So truth was a combination of facts and the conceptual matrix within which it was appropriately located in the discourse. Yeah. So we have a set of facts, and those facts are organized within a conceptual matrix that makes sense of them. And this reminded me of a book I've been recently reading. The book is Taliban by Ahmad Rashid. It was published originally in 2000. And it is a great book. I really like that book. And what is one of the things that is really great about it is that the book is divided into 3 parts, and the story of Taliban, the origin of them, the roots of the development.
Is it a history of the organization?
Yeah. So in the first of the 3 parts, Taliban is viewed within the conceptual matrix of politics and military conflict. The second part, again, the same story, but now the conceptual matrix is Islam and religion. Again, the third part tells the story again. This time it is in terms of oil and resources. So it is really great because at the end, the reader ends up wondering, similar to how White praises great works of history. At the end, you end up wondering, so which one is it? What is the best explanation?
If only that third part could have been another thesis, we would have been on Hegel again.
Bring it back, right?
Yeah.
To be another thing altogether.
So we have the facts, but I think that White here wants to caution us about the potential sacrificing of the facts. Like, we shouldn't completely say, okay, it is the image of the duck, it is the big picture that matters. That's the only thing that we are expressing. And the facts are subservient to that big picture, to that theory. Instead, what makes a great work of history great is that the facts persist, they have the stubbornness about them, and they cannot be completely explained using one theoretical framework. It cannot be just explained in terms of the oil, it cannot only be explained in terms of military conflict and foreign intervention, although that's a big part of it, but there are other elements. There are other ways of making that big picture, and they all make sense. So
it was,
go ahead.
One of the things that really got me, and this is sort of, I mean, it's completely tangential to the larger point of the essay itself, but in the beginning of the essay where he's talking about the historical, how history used to be perceived, and its major practitioners sort of focusing and emphasizing and de-emphasizing certain practices over long periods of time, kind of got me interested in the politics, I guess you could say, of certain disciplines in academia, like how you see, like, I guess what you could call what happened in historiography during the 19th century would be an anti-linguistic turn. But if you're familiar with what happened about 100 years ago in Anglophone philosophy in England and the United States, the exact opposite happens. It's all about language. Instead of trying to shove language under the rug, it's almost this atomistic dissection of, that's what the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus is all about, right? I mean, Wittgenstein, but I mean, A.J. Ayers and John Searle and all that, I mean, they spent their entire lives talking about how language works. So, but it's interesting how these sort of institutional concerns drop and fall and ebb and flow over the centuries.
Oh yeah. No, well, I really like that line as well, Davood, and it did make me think, because my wife and I did that thing on critical thinking, and in the paper where we talk about critical thinking, like one of the things is the ability to be aware of the conceptual matrix that's in operation, and actually to move between conceptual matrix. It's almost like is it 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird by Wallace Stevenson? The different ways of looking at a blackbird. So like if you're only staying in a single conceptual, I really like that design of that book. That's brilliant. Because like, if you're only staying in a single conceptual matrix, in the paper, we say you can think well, and you can even you can think very well and intelligently, but you don't actually engage in critical thought unless you move between conceptual matrices. And that's where we actually link up empathy and critical thinking a lot, because empathy is where you don't just put your shoes in another person's shoes, but you put your feet in another person's shoes and really try to understand the world through their entire framework. And of course, that's really difficult and much harder, but I really like bringing together empathy and critical thinking, and to really kind of think of empathy as a very intellectual act, not just something like understanding a person. Now, I like that too, because then understanding requires emotion. It can't just be intellectual. It has to be a whole person. You have to know their history, the social intelligence, like understanding, if it gets linked up with empathy, and empathy with critical thinking, and that moving between conceptual matrices, and then that it all kind of comes together. And it feels like that's really needed in order to get a more what I call polytheoristic view, not just monotheory, where you have a single conceptual theory or conceptual matrix and you understand everything through. So I really like the design of that book. And yeah, John, I was very struck as well by this kind of funny movement, pro and then against, the anti. That's a really great way to put it, linguistic turn. And it's funny how that shows. And I didn't think about that as the political questions of what's going on at the time. That's extremely interesting. It was curious to me. I guess I located some of this as the spread of Immanuel Kant's thinking was going around the world and becoming more popular, because as you accept the premise of the noumenon, you become increasingly, if you take the popular versus the Hegelian interpretation of the noumenon, then subjectivity is what keeps you from truth. And so if you want to get to truth, you need to remove the subject as much as possible. You need to remove subjectivity. You need to just get to the raw facts as much as possible. And even if you can never get to the things themselves, they're like asymptote lines, I guess. You can get as close as possible. But of course, there's a really big assumption in all of that, which is that subjectivity can be right. I can subjectively be right about X. Just because I'm subjective about X does not mean I am therefore wrong about X. Maybe I'm incomplete. You actually can't make the assumption that when I think about this bookcase, that what I think about this bookcase has nothing to do with the thing in of itself of the bookcase. You'd have to actually be across the noumenon to know for sure that my take on the bookcase in the phenomenological realm has nothing to do with the noumenon realm. So there's actually been a leap to assume that if there's any subjectivity involved, it's always a bad thing, that it's always keeping you from. But if you accept, I think it just helps Mr. Wyden's case, if you accept the fact that just because subjectivity is involved, that doesn't necessarily lead to less truth or less accuracy. It It's very easy for it to, because you have to work so hard, but it's not necessarily a hindrance to the truth, to what actually occurred. Then you don't have this hard reaction against the involvement of fiction in history, or the involvement of a subjective arrangement. There will not be, because one, I think White is correct, you can't avoid that, but the fact that you can't avoid it will not lead you to some sort of epistemological despair, that the epistemic despair, nihilism, that we can't know anything. It would only do that if we take Kant, who, as we know, greatly influenced Ayres and all of the, the Wittgenstein, all these different people, as a sort of hard noumenon line, as meaning that therefore subjectivity has nothing to do with what's on the other side. So I think that's been a mistake, is to assume that the involvement of a subject will necessarily keep us from getting to what the case is, to how things actually are.
Did either one of you ever read that great essay by Thomas Nagel that he wrote in the 70s called
On the Bat?
The Bat one?
Yeah,
yes,
like
which exactly ties into what we're talking about now. I think there is sort of a colloquial, naive misunderstanding of what we say when we're talking about subjectivity, as in pure opinion, pure bias, pure you can't look at anything fairly, right? But without the subject, you have no facts.
You have nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Because the subject is what does all of the facts. I mean, being a subject only means having a mind. That's all it means. And without the mind, you can't gather dates, places, names, let alone, create a narrative which makes sense of any of them. So.
Well, and again, to your point, John, the event is more fundamental than the facts, if I use that language, right? The facts emerge because of the subjectivity. And so it's this really weird double move where we say, we can't rely on the subjectivity, we can only rely on the facts that are possible because of the subjectivity. But hush, hush, don't say it.
Right, sweep it under the rug.
Sweep it.
You talked about the difference between truth and the absolute. Maybe we can also talk about the difference between facts and knowledge, or instead of facts, maybe we can say information. We can say things like there's too much information now, but it doesn't make sense to say there's too much knowledge, because knowledge involves knowing people, knowing subjects. There are people who know, and the other difference between information and knowledge is that information doesn't imply any time, any progression. It doesn't entail an event. So information amasses, and there's no time, it's just space. There's a lot of space that stores that information. On the other hand, knowing takes time. It takes time to spend time with those facts, with those pieces of information, to gain a knowledge about them. That's why there's a difference between knowledge that comes out of spending time with something for 10 years, 20 years, as opposed to knowledge that comes out of, I don't know, a day or 2 days. The difference, even if there's no difference between the information, there is difference in knowledge in those two scenarios. Now, is it too soon to get into the Darwin example? So Hayden White brings in Darwin and he refers to his work, The Origin of Species, as the summa of all factual collections of facts. And he says that, like any work of any classical work of literature that we keep returning to, keep being inspired by, intrigued by, it involves both facts and organization, conceptual organization, fictive elements that organize the facts. And he points to something that Darwin is doing in addition to arranging his facts about species, genera, and differences and similarities. So maybe we can talk a little bit about what it is that he's doing, why his work counts as both fiction and factual.
Okay, well, I mean, like I said, I read it twice, and I've always found that the examples that he uses to clarify his theory are
what makes it worse.
It absolutely makes it worse every single time, because he is He uses just the worst examples, and it's like you could choose such clear, just crystal clear examples if you chose another book or another example from the same book, but he just wants to like make it hard for you. I don't know. So from what I I remember reading this too, but he's basically just Darwin is using the sort of trope of similarity, as opposed to does he talk about Alfred Russel Wallace, or does he just assume that we know who he is?
He doesn't talk about Wallace or anybody else.
Okay.
Alternative ways of
he does mention that the basic biological discovery that Darwin had made. Let me see the language that he uses. Okay, so this is on the last page, the 3 or 4 sentences from the end of the paragraph on 134. It is not the doctrine of natural selection advanced by Darwin that commended him to other students of natural history as the Copernicus of natural history. That doctrine had been known and elaborated long before Darwin advanced it in The Origin. What had been required was a redescription of the facts to be explained in a language which would sanction the application to them of the doctrine as the most adequate way of explaining them. So he seems to think that evolution was already
people thought about it,
well understood. I was under the impression that Wallace stumbled across evolution like within a year or two of Darwin. Maybe my knowledge of the history of science is not exactly what it should be, but I thought they discovered it right at the end of the 1850s together. But that, of course, Darwin is looking at things changing gradually over time, and that, you know, it all depends on how you couch the change, right. You know, whether it's different changes in different kinds or a continual change of one kind.
So assuming that the idea of evolution existed before Darwin, so there's this idea of evolution, the concept of evolution, but then nobody managed to present the facts or re-describe the facts in such a way that that idea became sanctioned. So it is the idea that the idea requires something to seem plausible, and that factor, that event, is a redescription, the proper redescription of the facts, to sanction this idea of this particular idea of evolution. And my reading of this chapter was that Darwin didn't just sanction the general idea of evolution, evolutionary theory, but a specific form of evolution which emphasizes differences in degree as opposed to differences in kind. And then the alternatives that we can discuss include Lyell and Alfred Wallace and other contemporaries, maybe.
Yeah, and John, I appreciate, like you say, John, you read it a bunch of times, you do wonder where Mr. White, you know, he talks all about literature and getting poetic skill, and then proceeds to make examples like this.
Totally loses it all when he tries to write.
He's like, you know, I don't know, Mr. White, if this is going to spread like The Origin of Species. You know, I'm not sure if this structure works so well. I feel like he had a bias to pick Darwin precisely because he claims the single crucial question: why are not all organic things linked together in inextricable chaos? You know, and I feel like he's hint, why isn't all of the events of history linked together by inextricable chaos? Hint, like he's saying, oh, it must be because there's some sort of logic that's connecting it. And what did Darwin do? He brought in, he made apparent, he made clear that sort of logic that people had known about evolution, but the structure was not described in such a way that was clear and that people could understand it. So it's almost like, I feel like White was like, and that's what I'm doing. You know, and I'm just doing that for history. So I felt like that's why he was so bent on going with Darwin, even though, like you say, you do scratch your head on it. And it is interesting to think, if he is correct on his understanding of Darwin, that the history and of science, the paradigm shift, Kuhn, all of this is actually very much more so almost is what he's saying, more so contingent on the language clicking, on the form clicking than the facts themselves. Because if in fact evolution was around for however long versus Darwin, but didn't take off till Darwin, and Wright is claiming that the reason it took off is because Darwin brought the magic skeleton key of language and connection and way of description that unlocked it, then it's almost like what I feel like White's wanting to say, therefore the literary is what actually makes science take off, not the science itself. He's really trying to it's almost like he's trying to position the theory that he's presenting as almost primary in paradigm shifts, not secondary, which is kind of fascinating. Like he's trying to make this move. I felt like, because I was reading the Darwin section, I'm like, why? What are you doing, man? Why are you going with this example? And I felt like he may have done it because that's the subtle implications of what he's saying, is that the literary getting that right is what causes the scientific paradigm more so than just the knowing of facts. Now you have to grant what he's saying about evolution being known ahead of time. And I guess there are books that claim it was in the Middle East. They had thinkers that thought that. I'm not too familiar with all of that. But if it's the truth, then it would seem to be he's suggesting the literature is what calls the presentation, the presentation of the science is what brings on the paradigm shift, not just the science itself. That's what I felt like he was doing, but that was just my take.
I wanted to add, in case either of you guys or anyone listening is interested, there is a fascinating book by an anthropologist who was working in the 1980s named Mary Douglas. She's a cultural anthropologist, and she wrote this very, very short, it's all of maybe 150, 180 pages. It's a series of lectures that she gave in England towards the end of her career, and it's called How Institutions Think. And it is, I read it 10 or 11 years ago and I actually reviewed it. It's somewhere on my YouTube channel. And it is, she talks about a lot of the same things, about how people working in a common pursuit of something share. She talks about collective action theory, and she talks about what it means to cooperate and humans coming together, and and she discusses, I think it's typhus or typhoid fever, when people were first discovering what it was, that they were looking for a cogent way to explain the data. And that it was only until, a few people started putting together ideas in a certain way that the actual scientific theory was accepted and bought into. It's fascinating, but
Wow.
It made me think it's got a lot of really interesting implications for like the philosophy of medicine and it basically any humanity, any people working together on a common problem.
Well, to me, that's really fascinating, because I guess when I was trying to understand why he did the Darwin example and trying to, saying, oh, it's the presentation that unlocks the paradigm shift, that therefore is kind of a double point, because he's saying, one, you can't avoid the fictional structure, and two, the fictional structure is what instigates the paradigm shift if we stick to that language. So why don't you just own the fact that there's a fictional structure and get really good at it and do it well, because that's going to bring on the paradigm shift. So it's almost like coming at both sides. He's like, one, you can't avoid it, and two, it's good for marketing. So why don't we just all sit down and get rid of this idea of a chronicle of facts and just own the role of the fictional structure, because that's actually going to, that's going to lead to quicker scientific advancement, social change, different things. Like if you really own it, then we can kind of move forward. If we get out of this monotheorist thinking of pure fact chronicle, we can actually advance quicker. I mean, that to me, that's really interesting. I'm gonna watch a video there, John, on Mary Douglas, because I couldn't help but read this and go, oh, well, so if we actually own the fact there's a fictitious, a fictional structure, it would actually accelerate, possibly have an accelerational dimension to scientific advancement.
And I don't remember if I talk about that, the typhoid, because I did it, 10 or 11 years ago. Sure. But I was fascinated because I was thinking, microbiologists here, 80, 100, 120 years ago when they were doing this, this is a matter of observation, recording, comparing notes, making sure your data looks like my data, and then we publish the paper, right? There's so much more that, when you just sort of end up looking at it. that actually goes into the sociology of what's going on and how people are working together to create a convincing idea that you can sell as science. It was, you think of all things that biology would be the most, transparent, but even biology needs its own story.
I wanted to add this note about the difficulty of this essay in general, and what the notes that you made about the examples making things more difficult. I think part of that has to do with Hayden White having in mind as his readers primarily people who are in opposition. They have contrary to the way, and one clue is in the opening sentence of this chapter, which is, quote, "In order to anticipate some of the objections with which historians often meet the arguments that follow." So he begins with this is for people who have these objections. The other passage I wanted to read from page 127 is this passage is about the effect of using rhetorical devices and language, fictive element of presentation unreflectively, and how that becomes even more obvious than if you're doing it self-consciously, if you own up to the fact that you are using fictive elements. So this is the second paragraph in the page. He says, "I would argue that these mythic modes are more easily identifiable in historiographical than they are in literary texts. For historians usually work with much less linguistic self-consciousness than writers of fiction do. They tend to treat language as a transparent vehicle of representation that brings no cognitive baggage of its own into the discourse." So that way of treating it actually makes them kind of like even more obvious in their rhetoric. Their rhetoric becomes more obvious because they are denying it. Anyways.
No, I really like that part. And then he also, kind of in line with that, he mentioned Tocqueville. He said, Tocqueville writes about the French Revolution, but he writes even more meaningfully about the difficulty of ever attaining to a definite objective characterization of the complex web of facts that comprise the revolution as a graspable totality or structured whole. So one of the reasons Tocqueville is great is because he's aware of the problems of historiography, and he's incorporating that into it. Likewise, the writer of fiction, I can tell you doing the short stories or the poems we just submitted, all the places open on September 1st, you're really aware of the connotations of words, of the structures of the words, how Azura is not the same as Sirlane, blues are not, there's not just one kind, you're super aware of it because you have to in the field. Whereas if you're just Sirlane is blue, it's as good as Azura, who cares? Navy, Azura, blue, it's all the same. No, it has a different visual image. And then likewise, saying hard, difficult, those have different connotations for different impenetrable, you can come up with these different terms. So writing does make you very aware of that, and also aware, I think also in fiction, precisely because you're trying to lead someone in a direction without turning on their alarm bells that they're being led or they predict where the plot is going. You don't want them to guess the plot ahead of time, right? So you have to, but you also have to have enough elements that when the ending comes, it makes sense. So you're always kind of aware that you're leading your reader. The historian writes as if they're not leading the reader anywhere. There's not the secondary level that's going on. I'm just presenting the facts. No. You're necessarily bringing them in a direction, and that's either good or bad. That doesn't mean it's a bad direction, but you need to be aware that that's occurring. And I do think fiction writers are more aware. So I found it really interesting how we talked about Tocqueville having this kind of awareness that this was going on as it was right. And I linked that, I marked that to the passage that you read, because I really like that passage too.
That's why
I wanted to add one thing before we, came close to wrapping it up or something. That Daniel, you asked a rhetorical, get it, that joke question about why don't you just come out and admit the fact that you're dealing with language? I mean, that would make things so much easier. You could get good at it, and then you wouldn't have to deny that you were doing what we all know you're doing in the first place. And I know you know the answer to this, and Davood knows the answer to this, but anyone who may not be watching, who doesn't have the benefit of reading along and sort of following what he's clearly saying about the internal politics of the profession of historiography as time goes on. Today, well, maybe not today, but 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, historians really have this, they still have that attitude from the 19th century or many of them did, that if I were to talk about language, I wouldn't be a historian anymore. I would be a philosopher, or even worse, a philosopher of history. And then I can therefore no longer be a real historian who just deals in facts. I'd be one of those namby-pamby poetic, whatever. And I wouldn't be dealing in things that really happen, that sort of naive BS.
Right.
But that is why a lot of people, you still get people like that. Richard Evans,
sure,
who used to be a Regis Professor of History at Oxford or Cambridge. He's attacked, I think I mentioned this a few videos ago, attacked Hayden White for basically paying too much attention to stuff like this.
Oh, yeah. I can also attest to the fact that in circles, in academic circles, where psychology is viewed as a science, a hard science, philosophy is actually a dirty word. To call someone philosophical, or to point out that somebody's doing something philosophical.
We gave birth to psychology.
Right. but to describe that now has become a derisive description, unfortunately. And
I haven't really talked to you, Davood, about your discontent, too much with your discontent with academics. The academic life, but I wouldn't be surprised if some of the stuff that and I'm not asking you to divulge any information, I'm just like throwing ideas out there right now, that you might be a little bit I don't know, disconcerted, like deflated about the fact that every discipline seems to just have its ebb and its flow of ideas, and that there's nothing really, it's like, whose side are you on? Are you a structuralist, or are you a post-structuralist? Are you a humanist, or are you a Freudian or a Jungian? Are you this or that? And for every discipline, you can have those those coin toss choices, where it's either a dichotomy or a trichotomy or whatever else. But usually people expect you to come down on a side,
on a camp, right? Choose a camp.
And people don't want to listen to sophisticated arguments. They want you to pick a side. Right.
Because usually it happens that people do end up with a side. Usually it's the side that happens to also be their advisor's side.
Of course, or the head of the department side.
Right. Yeah. And the advantage of that, the practical advantage of that, is that all these scholarly works that required the intellect and the imagination very effectively turn into procedures and technical moves. So knowledge becomes techne. And then you can repeat what your advisor or what the head of the department has been doing. You don't need to really think too much, or not much. And it's also on the other side, on the side of the teachers, it is easier to teach you a set of procedures and make sure that you become productive as quickly as possible. So it has those types of advantages, but those advantages, we would agree, are not scholarly. They don't produce.
They produce publications, but the degree to which they produce wisdom is more questionable.
To say the least.
well, and I think there are, like you're saying, Davood, there's practical reasons for the reality, but I think one of the reasons we're seeing this surge of people online, I know we're all we can't avoid bubbles, but there's this interest in online education, watching YouTube channels, conversations like this, is because there's this hunger, to use my term, for polytheism, like people who move between multiple theories, structuralism, go to looks to religion, but then also comes to secularism. You also have this group of people that seems, and maybe it's the internet, where it's like, I don't want to just be an economist. I don't want to just be an expert on Keynes or something, or money velocity. I also want to understand like the history of money and also the philosophy of money. And I don't want to just be an expert on one thing because it feels so siloed. Now, at the same time, there's a danger between being a generalist and you're not good, the jack of all trades and the expert of none. So there's something to be said about specialism. I always like how Dietrich Miklowski put it. He says, specialize in something, but read widely. Right? Specialize, but read widely, and he meant outside of the field, because, very often it's actually by going outside the fields that you can see economics from a different angle. You can see the role of sociology. I think I won't get into it, but I think like we've really actually misunderstood a lot of the wealth of nations by not taking the sociology that Adam Smith is talking about. We just think about it in terms of small systems and all these different things. But anyway, so I think the internet has kind of unveiled that there's this explosion of a desire for polytheism to avoid institutional capture, because people, because if I bring back to what I was saying, you have the truth, which is everything that is the case. And then you have the absolute, which is everything that is the case, plus us and our reaction to those facts, of which then change us, which change how the new facts that arise. You have this sort of process. And the thing is, if the absolute, though, is the truth plus us. So you need to know the truth. That's why the facts matter. Like, you have to know everything that is the case. But if you only have the facts or the data, data but not information, then you'll feel like you have a lot of explanations, but you won't feel addressed. Is the language I like to use. Like, people, we don't just want to go into learning to explain things. We also want to address the world we live in. Like, we want to understand how it's here and how we fit into it. Now, there's dangers in that, because your desire for meaning and understanding can override the facts and you start looking for things. But you see, that's the beauty of polytheism. Like, the wider you get all these dialectical and you have them compete with one another, just like Hayden White is talking about, the different the conceptual apparatuses, they compete with one another. You can better balance that. So to find, I think for me, what Hayden White invites you into is a way of thinking that doesn't sacrifice the truth, but also doesn't just leave you in the realm of pure explanation without any address. Because by bringing in the fiction, you can see a story. And since you live a story, none of us live a chronicle, you can learn from it better and then work to try to get at it, to not just settle with some sort of pure relativism. So, I have some hope in that. I feel like, there's a lot of pessimism out there in the world today, but actually just seeing on the internet this sort of explosion of academic interest in different things shows me that there's a lot of people who who want to get to stuff that matters and to do it outside of institutional capture, not because institutions are inherently bad. I don't want to live in a world without institutions. You can go too far either way, but one also does have to acknowledge that there can be institutional capture. And the fact that you have so many people that are on their own seeking a sphere to seek address, not just explanation, to seek all of these different ideas kind of gives me hope, despite all of the craziness that can be out there sometimes.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's
everyone.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Until next time.
Okay.